Hello, and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in films, television, and in books. And this is the second part of a video on Star Trek Discovery, Season 1, Episode 8. And I'm looking here specifically at the Stamets and Tilly scenes and the Klingon scenes. Hopefully, be a nice short video because these scenes are a little thinner, but they still had some very interesting things that happened. So, starting with Tilly and Stamets, obviously we have that scene immediately after the battle where Stamets comes out of the pod, the glass cage thing, and he's disoriented. He calls Tilly captain. He doesn't know where he is. Um, Tilly's concerned about him, and Stamets then is very cold and very cruel to her to cover his own confusion and the fact that probably he shouldn't be on duty. We then have a later scene in the episode where Stamets is sitting in the mess and Tilly comes over, plonks herself down in front of him, and basically says, "What's going on?" They have a discussion. Stamets reveals that he is suffering from disorientation every time they do a jump, and it seems to be getting worse, and that he has difficulty remembering where he is and who people are, and then suddenly it's fine. And what's really nice about this sequence is it ties into ever since he got the DNA from the tardigrade, we've had these little snippets of Stamets being changed by it. Firstly, we had his mirror image responding to a different time to the physical Stamets. So Stamets was brushing his teeth, walked away, and then the mirror image was standing there, and then it walked away. So there was a time delay. In the Mud episode, we see that Stamets isn't affected by the time crystal in the same way. So again, there's something different there. And we've also seen a change to his personality where, I thought it was a little exaggerated, but he seemed more fun, more relaxed, and less uptight. But the second part of this, so obviously, so the first part that I liked was the fact it is tying all of this together, that there are these changes. It's referring back to these previous episodes. It's giving you that continuity of development. It's not forgetting about what happened in previous episodes. The second aspect that I liked is when Stamets is talking about why he isn't doing anything about this, why he isn't talking to Dr. Culbert, is not because he's afraid really of what's going to happen to him, but he's afraid of what is going to happen to Hugh Culbert, the doctor, his husband. Because if Stamets gets taken away by Starfleet to be studied, then that's leaving Hugh on his own. If Hugh doesn't tell Starfleet about all of these things and Hugh loses his commission, Hugh loses his job. And Stamets is worried about that. His motivating factor here is actually his love for his husband. And this is a really nice increase in the character depth. Like, I really did like this because Stamets has the cold, scientific, rational, engineering type personality when he's working with the spore drive. Stamets had the slightly odd problem with social interaction. And we've seen a couple of glimpses of this relationship that shows him to be a much more rounded character than any sort of two-dimensional stock, here's your weird scientist guy. And so adding this in, I really enjoyed it simply because it made him more real and it showed a depth to his emotion that makes us think now that a lot of what he does is repressing that in a professional sense, but he still has those feelings. So it was a nice way to show us that Stamets is deeper than we think. And even though they spelled out he's worried about these things, they don't spell out those ramifications. They let the audience come to those realizations ourselves. And I really enjoyed that. I like show, don't tell. So what was my problem with this? Well, number one, Tilly, as a cadet, goes to her superior because she works for Stamets in the spore drive, plonks herself down in public in the canteen and basically demands to know what's going on. And I have problems with that because Tilly has shown herself to be nervous, has shown herself to be unsure of herself. And here she is questioning her commanding officer or her superior officer. And then Stamets, you know, dismisses her, which I thought was absolutely fine. But then she just sits there for a couple of seconds and Stamets breaks. And rather than this seeming like Stamets really wanted to talk to someone, all of the power of this dynamic was placed on Tilly, that she's forcing the conversation and she's in this position where she's making him uncomfortable and he needs to tell her. And so what I would do about this is I would kind of invert it, in that we already had that earlier scene where Stamets was cold to Tilly and rude to her. And instead then of filming the mess hall scene, if they had filmed this scene in the spore bay, in the spore room, because we could have had the other engineers leaving at the end of their shift, Tilly coming up and going, here's the report of blah, blah, blah. And Stamets going, fine, cadet, get out of here. And Tilly pausing, looking a bit hurt, going to walk away. And then Stamets having that pause and go, Tilly, come back. He apologizes for being rude to her. And that starts the conversation. Because then we're putting it on, it's Stamets is actually the one who is making the decision. He's being more proactive. Yes, Tilly is still the instigator. We still have Tilly necessary to get that conversation started. And through the whole discussion, he then uses the rationale for why he wants to get Tilly on board to keep an eye on him, is he relies on the fact that Tilly is always going to be there when he comes out of the spore cube. And he said that you're always going to be here. You're always going to see me. You'll be able to judge when I am and am not myself. And so we can have that deepening of the trust. We can get to exactly the same narrative point. We can have basically the same conversation, but we give Stamets a bit more support for why he's trusting Tilly. And we give Tilly a better foundation for now why she's being accepted into and trusted by Stamets. And that would actually go to her confidence. That would go to building her character, because she's a fascinating character, but she is a cadet. And so this would be a nice way. She's building a relationship with Burnham. This is a way to build a relationship with Stamets. And so we have that nice dual development that'll allow her character to evolve to become more confident. And that's about the only thing I would change in that, just to give it that sense of privacy. So Stamets is more likely to talk to her, and a sense of a reason to trust Tilly. Because up until now, Tilly has kind of blabbed things and Tilly has talked out of turn. And Stamets is discussing things that have severe professional and personal ramifications for both him and his husband. So trusting Tilly with this, for me, I would like there to be a bit more of a rationale, a bit more evidentiary support for it. But apart from that, I really like that scene. I really like that development. So moving on then to the Klingon scenes. The Klingon scenes are incredibly thin. There's not a huge amount of story here. It's more sort of almost description of events. But one of the big things I liked is the reappearance of Admiral Cornwall. You know, we are now going back to the story. She got abandoned. She was kidnapped by the Klingons. Lorca decided not to rescue her. And now we see what happened to her. We've had one episode where she's been missing. And now we catch up on that. So, number one, I really like that, returning to something that was in a previous episode and joining that up. They did the same thing with Mud reappearing. I really like it when narratives pay attention to what happened earlier and connect the dots. It gives you a real sense of a continuing universe, a continuing story, that these things are going to have repercussions 4 characters. So I really like that. My issue with this is I don't quite understand L'Rell. Now, I know there's more episodes in the series, and hopefully a lot of these things will be explored and developed. Plus, in my head, I keep calling her L'Oreal instead of L'Rell. But because L'Rell is so obscure, obtuse, convoluted, sneaky, because we don't really understand her actual motivations for anything, because she has not been developed, we've gotten very little screen time with her. It's very difficult to place her in the narrative to find out what's going on. It's not even that she's been there and we get an impression of her. She just hasn't been there. So I wasn't as emotionally invested in this whole, is she going to betray the general? Is she not going to betray the general? Even the scene where she comes across the dead Klingons in the body room, and she says their names and she seems very, very upset. Don't know who any of them are. Are these the spies of hers that she had planted in this whole facility that she told the general about at the start? And for someone who is meant to be tricksy and covert and subtle, she flat out tells the leader of this army that she's ostensibly trying to join that she has spies in his camp. Like, rule number 1, don't tell people you have spies in their group because they're just going to look for them. But she sees these Klingon warriors who are dead, and she gets very upset and vows revenge, and then immediately goes and pledges allegiance. So again, I know there's stuff meant to be going on here, but none of it is really signaled. None of it is properly foreshadowed. None of it has any sort of evidentiary support. So I am assuming that her pledge of allegiance, her oath of loyalty, is in some way a ruse. It's a trick to play on call to lure him into a false sense of security. I'm just kind of guessing because I really don't know what her end game is. I don't know what she wants to do. Is she anti-Federation? Is she pro-Federation? Is she the worship of Kalis? Does she want a united empire? Does she not want it? There's so much up in the air because she hasn't been developed. But let's talk about one of the aspects I didn't like about this. So she and Cornwall basically we're going to escape together. And there's a shot of them walking through the corridors. Now, this is a ship full of Klingons, none of whom are basically loyal to L'Rell. And L'Rell says, don't worry, we won't get caught. I know this place like my home because for many years it was my home. But they're trying to escape and they're just wandering down the corridor. There's no plan here. It's not like in Star Wars where they had Chewbacca wearing the manacles to pretend he was a prisoner. They're just ambling down the corridor. And it's not even walking in a way that makes it look like L'Rell is escorting the prisoner somewhere. They're walking side by side and having a bit of a chat. So even if someone just walked past, which obviously is what happens, they would look at it and go, that doesn't look like, where do you think you're going? That doesn't look normal. The second thing is, and I think this was a production decision, the dialogue that they were having as they were walking along the corridor extended past the length of the physical set because both of them come to a stop at what is ostensibly at least a T-junction. So they're exposed in 3 different directions, at least 3 different directions. And they stop to have a chat. Now, I don't know about you, but if I'm trying to escape a ship where everyone on it is basically hostile, I'm not going to stand in the open and have a wee face-to-face parley with my mate just for the hell of it. They're not trying to be discreet. They're not acting in any way as if they are trying to escape. They don't have a ruse. They don't have a plan. They're just walking along the corridors and then stop in the middle of an intersection to talk. Are they trying to get caught? And then you get into that endless cycle of, well, is Laurel trying to get them caught because we don't know what her motivations are? And of course, then the general walks out behind them. I'm fairly sure he walks out from the left hand side into the middle of the corridor, spots them there. Laurel and Admiral Cornwall immediately start a fight because they have to pretend. And Laurel, I actually quite enjoyed this, beat the hell out of the Admiral, but then throws her into this sort of power pylon-y thing, presumably power coupling, and electrocutes the Admiral. My problem with that is she's holding the Admiral in the electricity. Wouldn't that electrocute her as well? Could you not have achieved exactly the same effect by throwing her into it, having her have the shock and fall to the ground? Without, no, I'm going to hold you with this live charge running through you, but for some reason it's not going to affect me, my bare hands, or any part of me. So I got a little bit annoyed about that. And then the Admiral's lying on the ground. She looks back. Laurel looks back at the general, and then the general just walks back the way that he came. And you go, but what? So he was walking along, saw something, and went, oh, I left the gas on. I have to go back to the room. Why not just have him carry on going where he was going? Because they have him walk back the way that he came, it creates the impression that him arriving was just this forced narrative decision because they had to be discovered. For some reason, they had to be discovered by the leader of this faction instead of another guard, for instance, or one of the other Klingon lords. So they get discovered by the leader of the faction. He turns up in this corridor, and then now that he's fulfilled his narrative function of discovering them, he just walks back the other way. So it feels forced and artificial. If he'd carried on walking, you could have got a sense that he walked down and went, oh, well, I'm glad you've taken care of that. Oh, whatever. And then carries on going about his business, which again gives you that sense that the world carries on. It's not just about what's on the screen, that this is meant to be us seeing into something that's happening in established reality. So are there ways to fix that? There's nothing really you can do with Laurel to fix that. Number one, I haven't finished the whole story arc, so I don't know how all of that develops. But she's such an underdeveloped character that putting the weight of this narrative about what's going on, if the showrunners want me just to intrinsically distrust her and not know what's going on, then they've succeeded. If they want me to kind of invest in her in any way, then they haven't really succeeded because I don't have enough to hang that on. With the Admiral, while I really love the fact that she's back in the narrative and we're now following up on that story thread, she's only been missing for one episode. So would have been nicer, if at all possible, if in the sequencing of Discovery, her kidnapping had come earlier. And then we could have had, and they could have filmed it all in one day, a number of different sequences of showing her slowly being tortured, that these would have been little inserts into each episode to develop a meta arc of what's happening to her. So Lorca's decision not to rescue her has significant ramifications, and each week we feel worse and worse and worse about what's happening to her. But because it's only been 1 week, she got kidnapped. We had the bottle episode. Here we go. So we've had, okay, so 2 weeks. We haven't really had a chance to appreciate what she's been going through. So that would be the only thing about that I would wish that they had changed, but I don't see an easy way to change it within this episode. There's a lot going on in this episode and its focus is elsewhere. One other minor thing about the Klingon scenes, when Laurel goes into the room that has all of the dead Klingons, did anyone else get the impression that the other Klingons are eating them? Because we see a lot of, cleanly severed limbs. We see a lot of them that look like they've been carved up. Are they trying to imply that the Klingons are cannibals? It just was such a bizarre scene And then, of course, Laurel names all of these people. We have no idea who any of them are. We have no connection to them. She names them all and seems very, very upset. So they're important to her. But for me as a viewer, I'm going, there's just a bunch of Klingon bodies. I don't know who any of these people are. I don't know what their importance is. Are they the spies? I don't know. Are the other Klingons eating them? I don't know. It, it just seemed like a bit of a wasted scene. And then she just leaves the Admiral's body lying on the ground. She doesn't even move the body out of the doorway. She basically has to step over it to get out of the room. So there were a couple of things about that Klingon sequence that they were very thin. They didn't, even with the character moment of Laurel and the Admiral when they're in the initial scene in the cell and talking, and there's a bit of détente between the two of them. The bit that is absolutely brilliant is where Laurel screams at the Admiral, and the Admiral screams back in her face, screams her defiance, and we get a real sense of Cormall's strength of character, her courage, that she will not be broken by these Klingons. That even after being tortured, even after being imprisoned, she still is defiant. Like that was great. And then we have the two of them sitting down as if they're sitting down and having tea. So a lot of it felt kind of rushed because they were trying to squeeze in a lot of story development or plot development to get through a whole sequence of actions, which will obviously have a payoff at a later point. But because of that, these were sketched out and not particularly deep scenes. So, like I said, this was a very, very quick one because going to the main mission of the show, that's going to be a longer video. But anyway, thanks for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.